Hey heroes, this is Mike L from the Comic Book Syndicate, and we just reviewed The Vision by Tom King and Gabriel Hernandez Walta. Let's summarize what the plot of this is. Essentially, you have an android. In this story, we find out he has created a wife and 2 kids, okay? And then it just goes from there. They move into a suburban house, and they're trying to fit in this neighborhood. It's not really a superhero comic. It's a fish out of water. It's an allegory for racism. It's an allegory for, integrating into the United States American culture. And that came out weird because I'm Canadian, but we don't have a melting pot in Canada. We have a salad bowl. It's almost the same, a little bit different. But I really feel like it's an excellent example of somebody taking an idea that was sort of created as a kid's story and then just expanding on it. And in my opinion, this comic knocked my socks off. It's probably the best Marvel comic I've read in years. And it's the first comic that's reminded me of Alan Moore's early work on Swamp Thing and Miracle Man. I want to know what you guys thought. Carlos, we're going to start with you. What was your impression of this comic?
I thought it was really good. I think it sort of got into these big ideas that like sci-fi or superheroes can sometimes get into, like what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be a family? And I thought the storytelling was really compelling. I thought it was really good.
Excellent. Oliver, what's your impression of this comic?
I liked it quite a bit. It gets into some kind of almost existential horror areas, which you don't really expect from a Marvel comic. And when you think of a comic that's described as dark, you think of like lots of violence, lots of swearing, lots of nudity, but like this is dark in sort of the way a Coen Brothers movie is dark, where there's, sort of these like escalating mistakes that lead to violence and just there's no real meaning behind it, and it's, just real nasty.
So one of the problems I had with recommending this book to people is I would say, you've got to read the new Vision comic. And they would always say, well, I've never been a fan of the Vision, so why would I read that? Well, really, the character of the Vision, he's an android. That's all that matters. Tom King has taken this tiny little concept of android and just expanded on that concept, added a family to that, added all of these different themes, added the years of history of Marvel Comics that most writers would dump and start fresh with. He collected all this continuity and used it as a framework for this incredibly complex story. Most writers would have stumbled when they tried to explore these concepts, but I don't feel like they did. I think he really pulled it off. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think he is sort of exploring these ideas, but it doesn't feel forced or hackneyed. And like you were saying earlier about, using the continuity, but also expanding on it, the character of the Vision is almost, in the family unit, he's sort of like the least important character. It almost like focuses more on his wife, Virginia, and his 2 children, Vin and Viv.
Oliver.
I think what's interesting about the comic is that it kind of uses, the kind of android template as sort of this allegory, and it kind of explores these issues of identity and trying to, pursue this sort of ideal life that you feel you should live up to, when you're someone who's actually kind of living on the margins and is sort of alienated from society, and to what extent that ideal is even worth pursuing.
I have a feeling that if anyone else, like if another medium were to adapt this, I don't think they'd do it as well. Do you agree?
I mean, I think they wouldn't do it in the same way that Tom King and Gabriel Hernandez Walta did it. There's a lot of really subtle storytelling things that have to do with words and pictures in here, especially sort of mixed narration and not knowing where narration is coming from, that I think it would be really difficult to reproduce in other mediums.
Again, we all watch the Marvel movies. We all like them. If Marvel were to get a hold of this story and adapt it, do you think it would turn out as well as the comic?
I think they could do some interesting things with it. I think what, makes this story interesting as a, comic book and as a superhero comic book is that, it has this pre-established set of expectations, and it does a really excellent job of subverting those expectations. And, when I first saw this book, I honestly thought it was like kind of a sitcom comedy type of a book, because that's sort of what the cover portrays. And pretty quickly as I was reading it, I was like, oh, so that's what kind of story this book is. So I think, with the movies, you don't have quite that same legacy that the comics, it doesn't stretch quite back as far, but I think they could still do some interesting stuff in a very similar vein.
I want to talk about at what point you realized that we were in for something different. For me, it was in the first issue when the narrator essentially says, I'm not going to give away what's exactly is happening, but the narrator basically says, oh yeah, these two characters, later on, the Vision murders them. And I was just like, what in tarnation is going on here? Not only do we have a complete story that can have foreshadowing, because that's what happens when you plan a story right to the end, but just the way that it was written, I knew that I was in for something different. Was there a moment for you, Carlos, where you realized this was going to be something special?
I think there were a lot of like small moments sort of spread throughout the book. There was definitely that moment of foreshadowing. I think as soon as the Vision's wife Virginia lies to him, and then it sort of becomes a much different story. It's not about necessarily protecting her, but how it sort of affects like their family unit. And it becomes a much different story from what I first expected. And then the prayer sequence, and talk about what prayer means to them, is a really affecting sequence that comes sort of completely out of left field.
Is there a scene for you that did it?
There's a villainous character from the comics that comes in and sort of disrupts the family's life. And the way that scene plays out is very different from how it would normally play out in a comic like this. And sort of the repercussions of that action are very different. And that's, I think, for me, the exact moment I knew what kind of a book this was going to be.
So if you were recommending this to someone and they were sort of resistant to it because they said, I don't care about the Vision, I don't read Marvel Comics, blah, 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 what is the one thing you would say to them to convince that person to read it?
If you like Blade Runner even a little bit, you should read this because it's almost better.
There you go. Okay, what's your one thing that you would say to somebody?
I'd say if you like, Coen Brothers movies, stories where people, get into these difficult situations and make mistakes, and those mistakes have consequences that just keep escalating, and, really kind of explores some of the, darker consequences of, how stories like this can play out, I would definitely recommend it.
There you go, guys. Vision from Marvel Comics by Tom King, Gabriel Hernandez Walta, and others.